COVID-19 vaccines are rolled out around the world. Some countries are issuing vaccination certificates and lifting restrictions for those who've had a jab. But will those who aren't vaccinated be left out as societies reopen? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. COVID-19 vaccination drives are in full swing in many countries. Some have begun issuing certificates for people to prove they've received the shots. It's raising concerns about potential discrimination. Nearly half of Israel's population has received at least one dose of the vaccine. The government is reopening hotels and gyms, but only to people with a so-called green pass to show they're either fully vaccinated or have recovered from COVID-19. Public health experts are worried about excluding those who are waiting to receive a shot or can't be vaccinated due to medical or other reasons.
You can divide between two populations if there is a good medical reason. So, for example, if someone was exposed to someone infected and is vaccinated, to tell him you don't need to stay at home, that's okay. That's a medical decision.
A British government review is looking at whether vaccine certificates could help to ease lockdown measures faster. The Prime Minister says there are many ethical and privacy challenges to work through.
We can't be discriminatory against people who, for whatever reason, can't have the vaccine. There might be reasons, medical reasons, why people can't have a vaccine, or difficulties that they, some people may genuinely refuse to have one. Now, I think that's a mistake. I think everybody should have a vaccine, but we need to thrash all this out.
Many countries are preparing to create so-called travel bubbles for people who can prove they've been vaccinated. Greece, Israel, and Cyprus have agreed to recognize each other's vaccine certificates. Those who have them will enjoy unrestricted travel. Greece is pushing for a similar arrangement across the European Union. But France and Germany remain wary. They've raised concerns over a two-tier system where some can travel and others can't. Many countries are moving towards favoring those who've been vaccinated. Qatar has dropped quarantine requirements, while Hungary is considering allowing them to be exempt from curfews. All right, let's bring in our guests in Reading. Dr. Simon Clarke, Associate Professor in Cellular Microbiology at the University of Reading. In Doha, Dr. Patrick Tang, Division Chief of Pathology Sciences at Sidra Medicine. And in Oxford, Dr. Dominic Wilkinson, Director of Medical Ethics at the Uehiro Center for Practical Ethics at the University of Oxford. Welcome to the program. Patrick, let me start with you. Do you believe that vaccine certificates are going to become the norm?
It's quite likely that different countries or different businesses might implement some form of vaccine efficacy or vaccine certificates in order to be able to certify that certain people are immune and to be able to have more efficiencies in their businesses and travel in protecting some of their critical infrastructure.
Simon, it's unclear at this stage if any of the COVID-19 vaccines that are out there actually prevent transmission of COVID-19. With that in mind, is it too early to be issuing vaccine certificates?
Well, I think if they're issued with the expectation that proof of vaccination is proof of being unable to transmit the virus, then it is too early. We're beginning to get good evidence with the Pfizer vaccine that there can be some protection against transmission. But I think the evidence is less good with the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, particularly if somebody doesn't have symptoms. So asymptomatic transmission, and that could account for a fair proportion of the transmission, really is the potential problem here.
Dominic, I saw you nodding along to some of what Simon was saying just there. Did you want to jump in?
Well, I think now is the time for us to be talking about vaccine certification because the evidence is emerging and because vaccine programs are rolling out. I think there's a very obvious incentive for countries to have a think about whether they can use vaccine certificates or vaccine passports as a way to move towards more normal life.
Patrick, what would vaccine certificates mean for those who would get them?
So I think that would mean very different things for different countries and different businesses that are going to utilize this, because it's a very complicated topic, and I think sometimes we simplify it too much, because we know that the vaccines are not 100% efficacious. The tests that we use to determine whether someone's immune or not are not 100% accurate. So it all depends on why and how you use these certificates, and how that's going to help us get back to like a normal way of living and restore our economies.
Simon, are we not talking about the real possibility at some point that we could see discrimination come into play with vaccine certificates? I'm talking about perhaps a two-tiered system of access for the haves and the have-nots.
Well, that's a distinct possibility. I mean, in the UK, there is emerging evidence that certain groups within the population are more reluctant to have the vaccine, or perhaps even have less access to it. So anything like that would fall under, I think, our discrimination laws, potentially. So yeah, it's a real possibility, and one that needs a full and frank discussion.
Dominic, there's an ethical debate that's been brewing for some time around this issue of vaccine certificates. Could you just talk us through some of the issues at play here that are being debated?
Okay, so the basic ethical argument in favor of vaccine passports is that it's justified to restrict people's freedom of movement, their freedom of association, their normal everyday freedoms, to reduce transmission of the virus, to prevent big surges of cases affecting our hospitals. But if somebody is immune, if it is the case that a vaccine confers immunity and they're at very much reduced chance of spreading the virus, then that case for restricting the individual disappears. And then it becomes a question of, is it justified to restrict that individual? I think there are two obvious areas of implementation of vaccine certificates and passports. One is in terms of quarantine when traveling between countries. If many countries currently have periods of a compulsory quarantine for quite long periods, often at quite considerable expense. If somebody's had, for example, 2 doses of an appropriate vaccine at an appropriate time, I think there's a strong case that they should perhaps not be required to have such a long quarantine. Also, cases of requirements for self-isolation after contact with somebody who's had the virus. If somebody has had the vaccine, that again looks like a place where they should potentially be exempt from that.
The World Health Organization has urged caution on vaccine passports. It's formed a Smart Vaccination Certificate Consortium. It's seeking to develop a common digital vaccine certificate that will be recognized by everyone. That will mean creating a global standard for vaccine recognition and coordinating the efforts of national governments. But the WHO has also said that for the time being, it opposes the introduction of vaccine passports allowing unrestricted travel. It said there isn't enough information yet on how effectively vaccinations can reduce transmission of the virus. Patrick, from your vantage point, what role is the WHO ultimately going to be playing when it comes to standardizing all of this, when it comes to vaccine certificates?
I think that they're going to have a hard time controlling all the individual countries, and individual countries making their own rules for their own people. And their own standards for whether people need quarantine or not after traveling. So I think if they don't come up with something that's acceptable to lots of different countries, all the different countries are going to make their own rules. And I think that the thing is, there's never going to be a perfect system for doing this. The vaccines are not perfect. Like you could get one vaccine that has a higher rate of efficacy. You get a different vaccine that has a lower rate of efficacy. So there's never going to be a fully equal system or a fully perfect system. But I think for practicality, I think that this is just something many countries are going to adopt. And I think one of the things that you mentioned was whether this could be used for travel. So travel is a very specific application for this, but there's lots of other reasons why this could be useful within a country or within a certain region. Look, I work in a hospital, and it's important that we know that the people entering the hospital don't have COVID, or that if they're immune to COVID, we could save money by not having to test them. So there's lots of practical reasons that could be applied in different situations, maybe not just for travel. And then each country might have their own rules too, because some countries might not have as much inequality in how they distribute vaccines, or they might have a higher rate of infection in their country. So then it would be okay for them to implement this for post-travel quarantine, so that people that are immune could come back and not be quarantined in their country.
Simon, it looked to me like you wanted to jump in and add to what Patrick was saying. Please go ahead.
I was nodding along because I agree with everything he's just said. I think the World Health Organization, if it comes up with a set of advice, it would be just that. It will be a starting place for lots of other countries to build on and amend, and they'll all come up with their own ideas about what they think suits them best. And it always needs to be remembered that none of these vaccines is 100% effective. And also, we don't know what it takes or what it means to be immune to COVID-19. We don't know what we call the correlates of protection and what they are. So if you measure a blood sample from somebody, we don't really know how what we measure relates to whether or not they're immune. So there's a huge amount of uncertainty around this.
Dominic, how concerned are you about the fact that governments will or won't be able to properly protect the health data of those who get the vaccine and have these certificates going forward?
Well, I think thinking about vaccine passports, we can look to other types of certification or other types of information. So one obvious analogy is regular passports. We're very familiar with regular passports, which have to be secure in the data that's held within them. That they need to be free from being easily copied or having fraud. In terms of health information, the information that's contained within a vaccine passport is not what most people would think of as sensitive health information. So it's not revealing somebody's personal health record. It's revealing whether or not they've had a vaccine. So that kind of concern about the safety or security of health information might not be so applicable.
Patrick, you had mentioned the issue of travel going forward just a few minutes back, so I want to follow up with you about that issue. If we're talking about issuing vaccine certificates for travel, or vaccine passports as some may call them, how would countries go about standardizing criteria for vaccine certificates? What I mean is, what if you've taken a vaccine that's been approved in one country, and then you wish to travel to another country where there's another vaccine that's been approved for use, only one vaccine, and it doesn't match with the vaccine that's been approved in your country? How will that issue be dealt with?
Well, I think you brought up an excellent point that this is a very complex issue, and you're right about that one country might not accept the vaccine from another country, or where they might not accept the serology assay from another country, or even from another laboratory that's not approved by them. So because of all of these things, every country is probably going to be a little bit on their own. That if I'm in this country and I got vaccinated in this country, or I got tested in this country, then that would allow me to become to be able to avoid post-travel quarantine when I come back to my home country, because that's where I was vaccinated, that's where I may have been tested, that's where there's a record of me having been infected before. So I think it might end up something like that, where each country has their own rules. So then your certificate may not apply in another country, because there is an agreement on how we do the testing, which vaccines work, which are accepted as proof of immunity.
I mean, Simon, this is a potentially very complicating factor, is it not? I mean, in order for something like this to really work when it comes to travel to lots of different places going forward, protocols and some form of standardization would need to be agreed upon, right?
Yes, it does. But of course, governments sometimes, or some governments, I should say, have a tendency to insist on their way or the highway. So some of them will not be very interested in listening to what, for example, the World Health Organization has to say. I can envisage circumstances where some countries will say, this is what we want, this is what we expect incoming visitors to have in terms of testing and or a vaccine. And if you don't like it, you can't come in. So I do think that, that while standardization is desirable, I think there are certain countries who will insist on doing it their own way.
Dominic, there's growing fears that this kind of documentation could exclude or discriminate against those who've been left most vulnerable so far by the pandemic. What do you say to that?
Well, one of the interesting things about vaccine passports, in countries that have deliberately chosen to vaccinate first those individuals who are most vulnerable and most affected by the pandemic, is that actually vaccine passports will serve to improve equality and to redress some of the inequality. So, for example, those who are in older age groups who are clinically vulnerable, who have had first access to the vaccine, will potentially have first access to some of the freedoms that might go along with that. But of course, there are some people who are going to miss out. For example, those who are young or are unable to have a vaccine perhaps for a medical reason, or who've chosen not to have a vaccine. And that, I think, raises a different ethical issue. Because, of course, if somebody chooses not to have a vaccine, then they choose to take on board the consequences of that.
Patrick, what about the fact that we don't yet know how long the effects of the vaccine will last? I mean, how much would that complicate this? At some point, would proof of boosters potentially be required?
I think the data is coming out that, the immunity can last quite long from natural infection, in at least 9 months from the earliest infections that we've had. And from the vaccines, we should expect similar level durations of immunity. And if we compare it to other vaccines, it probably lasts at least 6 months, if not longer. So I think what you said is probably going to happen, where we're going to have either boosters or we're going to have some kind of testing to ensure that we still have a certain degree of immunity. But as Simon said before, we don't really know, even if you were tested, that whether and you have antibodies, that you're necessarily immune. Right? So all of the measures that we have are inaccurate. So I think whatever system we implement, we have to accept some degree of inaccuracy in there. But we can't have a perfect system. We have to have something that's just good enough so that we can return to some semblance of normal life.
Dominic, looked to me like you wanted to add to that. Please go ahead.
Well, so I think one thing that you're talking about is we don't know how long immunity will last, or perhaps it will wane, so what will happen then? Well, we're used to the idea that visas are time limited, and it seems quite possible that vaccine passports will also expire and require potentially revalidation or evidence of boosters, or that they might need to be renewed if in 6 months' time we find that the immunity is longer lasting. So although we don't know that immunity is going to last for 6 months, 12 months, 2 years yet, that doesn't mean that in the next 6 months we have to just wait and take no action.
Simon, I want to talk for a moment about the effect that this could have in the long term. I mean, do you foresee that having to get these certificates or having these certificates issued will encourage more people to get vaccinated? I'm talking specifically about people who might either be hesitant to get the vaccine or might just be afraid to get the vaccine right now and want to wait a little bit longer.
I think that for travel, I think the effect on that would be small. There would be some, but I don't think it would be huge. I think the bigger plus is if you start freeing up society. If you say to people, you can go to the cinema or a restaurant or a theatre or a football match or whatever, but only if you've been vaccinated, that's where the biggest driver of vaccination will come from, I think.
Patrick, let me pick up on a point that Dominic was making earlier about those who may not be able to get the vaccine for one reason or another, perhaps a health reason. Maybe they have allergies or underlying health conditions. I mean, what happens to them in a scenario like this, where more and more people are being encouraged to get the vaccine and would get these vaccine certificates that would either allow them to re-enter businesses or sectors of society or to travel?
I think this is a difficult problem to address, and there's going to be at least some interim period where there's going to be some inequality for people that have some reason why they cannot get the vaccine. But as more and more people become vaccinated, and as more and more people become immune because of natural infection, then that will create that environment of herd immunity where these people can then again have some of their freedoms without having to be vaccinated or be exposed to the disease. So I think that's going to be a matter of time. And eventually, we know that this pandemic is going to eventually end, and we know that eventually we'll get back to normal. It's just a matter of time. And some people it's not going to be fully equal in that interim period.
Dominic, I saw you nodding along. Looked like you wanted to jump in. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think some people are concerned about vaccine passports because they have this idea that this is going to be a permanent change to our ability to move around unless we provide these sort of medical certificates. Of course, we don't know quite what's going to happen with coronavirus in a year or 2 years or 5 years' time. But I think it's reasonable to assume that these phenomena of these vaccine passports are a short-term measure. They're a way to get from here in the pandemic to a post-pandemic more free world.
Simon, if more countries start requiring vaccine certificates or if they start offering vaccine passports, isn't this essentially making the vaccine mandatory?
Not necessarily for travel, if that's what they're needed for. But again, I come back to my point of wider participation in society. That's when it de facto becomes more or less mandatory. So yeah, I can see that unless governments legislate to prevent organizations of any sort insisting on the vaccine passport, be it, like I say, a restaurant or a theatre or a sports ground, and unless they legislate against them insisting on seeing that passport, then they will become the vaccine will become compulsory, effectively.
Dominic, around the world, there are large inequities when it comes to the vaccine and who has access to it. I mean, going forward, how are governments going to guarantee that vaccine certificates or passports will be fair?
Well, I think that there are very serious issues to do with global inequality in vaccine distribution. And my concerns about that are not about vaccine passports and travel, which are really for those who are relatively fortunate. It's about the much more serious issue in terms of lives and illness. And I think that is the reason why globally there needs to be, and there already is, but there needs to be more attention to how can we distribute this vaccine as quickly as possible to all of those around the world who would want it and benefit from it.
Patrick, just very quickly, we only have about 45 seconds left. How about the fact that new strains are emerging right now? Is this the right time to be rolling out certificates while all this is happening?
I think eventually the pandemic is going to end, and what we can control is how long it takes before we get back to a normal state. So I think anything that we do to bring back normalcy is going to be helpful. So this might not be a perfect solution. There might be new variants coming out, but then we just need to tackle those problems as they come along. Just like inequality, we got to tackle that. And if new variants come up, then we have to develop new vaccines. So we shouldn't try to wait for this perfect system and hijack this whole initiative because of all these different things. We just have to deal with them as they come along, just like everything else.
All right, we run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all our guests, Dr. Simon Clarke, Dr. Patrick Tang, and Dr. Dominic Wilkinson. And thank you, too, for watching. You can watch this and our previous programs anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.